treaty is a forgery, Your Grace. He means to betray you before dawn.
In the great houses of 19th century England, there were two kinds of invisible people. The first kind were the ones society chose not to see. The maids, the footmen, the quiet figures in grey cotton who moved through grand rooms like shadows, keeping the machinery of aristocratic life running while the powerful men who benefited from their labor looked straight through them. The second kind were far more dangerous. They were the ones who chose to be invisible, who understood that in a world where reputation was currencies and knowledge was power, being unseen was the most strategic position a person could occupy. On the night of the autumn equinox in the year 1842, a parlour maid named Nicole Steele stood alone in the locked study of Portland, the most powerful private residence in the north of England. She had been sent in to clean melted wax from the desk before the Duke returned to sign the treaty that would define his dynasty for the next 50 years. She was supposed to look at nothing but the wax. She was supposed to hear nothing but the storm. She was supposed to disappear back into the servants' corridor before the great men of the realm returned from their brandy. Instead, her eyes fell on Clause 9, and everything changed. Hidden within the elegant cursive of that single clause was a legal mechanism so precise, so devastating, and so perfectly concealed that it had escaped the notice of 3 royal solicitors, 2 parliamentary advisers, and every aristocratic ally the Duke possessed. If he pressed his signet ring into the wax tonight, the most feared nobleman in England would wake tomorrow morning with nothing. No title, no lands, no Portland Hall, no name. Nicole had approximately 10 seconds to decide who she was going to be: the invisible servant who survived by seeing nothing, or the Earl of Robinson's daughter, who had been raised to believe that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of crime. What she chose in those 10 seconds did not merely shatter the peace of Portland Hall. It rewrote the social laws of an empire. Before we enter that locked study before the ink and the candle and the 10 seconds that changed everything, there are questions worth sitting with. Who was the woman behind the grey cotton uniform? What specific rare knowledge did a parlour maid possess that had escaped the most brilliant legal minds in the Crown's employ? And why did the ruin of the House of Portland terrify her more than her own destruction? What drove a man carved from ice and political calculation to make a choice that stunned high society so completely that newspapers debated it for months? What happens to a man who has spent his entire life building walls when he encounters the one woman whose specific, irreplaceable brilliance makes those walls feel, for the first time, like a prison rather than a fortress? And what is the true cost of being invisible for so long that the world forgets you were ever anything else? Stay with us, because the story buried inside Portland Hall, beneath the treaties and the forgeries and the glittering cruelty of aristocratic society, is ultimately a story about something far more universal than titles and bloodlines. It is a story about what we owe each other when we see the truth that everyone else has missed, and what we risk when we finally decide to speak it. To understand Nicole, truly understand her, not merely the version of her that history recorded, we must go back to before the grey cotton uniform, back to before the calluses were anything other than the marks of a pen held for hours, back to when her name was Lady Nicole Robinson, and the world knew it. Her father, Owen Robinson, Earl of Leeds, was the kind of man who was celebrated in scholarly circles and quietly underestimated by political ones, which was, as it happened, precisely where his enemies wanted him. He was the Crown's foremost authority on political document authentication. He could identify a forgery in 3 languages, detect chemical ink alteration under candlelight, and read archaic legal dialects that most sitting members of Parliament had never encountered. And he taught his daughter everything. Not because it was fashionable, it was emphatically not fashionable. Not because it would help her make a good marriage. It would demonstrably not. But because Owen Robinson believed, with the quiet conviction of a man who had spent his life studying the damage that ignorance caused, that the sharpest protection he could give his only child was a mind that could not be fooled. By the time Nicole was 18, she could authenticate a crown treaty, detect heat-sensitive chemical ink by the specific sheen it left on parchment in low candlelight, and translate legal Latin into plain English faster than most solicitors half again her age. She also spoke French, archaic court dialect, and 2 continental languages, not for social performance, but because her father had shown her that the most important conversations in England's political history were frequently conducted in languages its participants assumed their enemies did not understand. She had been raised, essentially, to see what others missed, which made what happened next one of the crueler ironies in the history of a century that was not short of them. The destruction of the House of Robinson arrived on a Tuesday evening in November, wrapped in legal language so precise it had clearly been prepared by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. A series of financial documents, bearing her father's signature, his seal, his specific notational style, were presented to the Crown as evidence of treasonous financial dealings with England's political rivals. The forgeries were extraordinary. Whoever had constructed them had studied Owen Robinson with the attention of a student, replicating not merely his signature, but the particular pressure of his pen, the angle of his letterforms, the idiosyncratic spacing he used between legal subclauses. The Earl of Robinson was stripped of his titles within a fortnight. The estate was seized before the month ended. And Owen Robinson himself, a man who had spent his life in service to the accurate preservation of truth, died in a debtor's prison 14 months later of a heart that had simply, quietly, declined to continue. Nicole was 22 years old. She had her mother, frail, bewildered, utterly unprepared for destitution, an unpayable mountain of debt attached to a disgraced name, and a mind full of knowledge that the world had just demonstrated it had absolutely no interest in recognizing. She was too intelligent to waste time on bitterness she couldn't afford. She understood the mathematics of her situation with clear, cold accuracy. A woman with a ruined name and no dowry had exactly one asset. And that asset was invisible, which meant it was safe. What she knew could not be seized by debt collectors. What she could do could not be taken away by a constable's notice. So Lady Nicole Robinson's, daughter of the Earl of Leeds, one of the most intellectually formidable women in England, buried her silk gowns, changed her name to Nicole Steele, and spent 6 weeks learning to look at the floor, to walk without sound, to be present in rooms without being seen in them, to become, in every observable way, exactly what the aristocratic world expected a parlor maid to be: nothing. Portland Hall had been in the Parkinson family for 200 years. It looked exactly like what it was, the ancestral seat of people who had spent 2 centuries accumulating power and had long since stopped questioning whether that accumulation was good for anyone beyond themselves. Dillon Parkinson, the 6th Duke of Portland, was 32 years old and had been managing the full weight of his duchy since the age of 19. When his father died unexpectedly, leaving behind a title, an estate with complicated debts, 3 unsettled political alliances, and approximately 0 emotional preparation for the son he left to manage all of it, Dillon had rebuilt the Portland finances through 13 years of ferociously disciplined political strategy. He had established alliances, dissolved dangerous ones, navigated 2 major parliamentary crises, and emerged from each with his power intact and his reputation. Cold, unyielding, brilliant, and completely self-sufficient, only reinforced. He did not require warmth. He did not seek connection. He viewed marriage as a contractual arrangement and emotional vulnerability, as the specific weakness that had undone every powerful man he had ever studied. He was, in summary, a man who had built a fortress around himself so effectively and for so long that he had entirely forgotten it was a fortress. He believed it was simply who he was. Nicole had been at Portland Hall for 4 months when the autumn equinox arrived. In those 4 months, she had learned the layout of every room, the schedule of every member of the household, the political significance of every visitor, and the emotional temperature of every conversation she was permitted to overhear while being invisible. She had also learned something about Dillon Parkinson that his parliamentary allies, his social peers, and his own household staff had entirely missed. Beneath the cold, beneath the control, beneath the absolute self-containment, there was a man who worked until 3 in the morning because the moment he stopped, the silence became unbearable. A man who had restructured an entire duchy out of grief for a father he never told he loved him. A man who was, in the most profound and private sense, entirely alone. Nicole recognized that particular loneliness. She had been living inside it for 2 years. And in the quiet of the library, where she was invisible and he was oblivious, she felt the first very dangerous thread of something she could not afford to feel. She pushed it down. She had work to do. The treaty had taken 11 weeks to negotiate. It represented a political alliance between the House of Portland and a consortium of 6 powerful northern lords. A coalition that would, if properly constructed, give Dillon's duchy unassailable influence over the northern border territories and the crown contracts attached to them. Dillon's chief advisor in the construction of this alliance was his cousin, Lord Harvey Ashby, a man of considerable charm, considerable intelligence, and considerably more ambition than Dillon had ever bothered to measure. Harvey had drafted the final treaty. Harvey had overseen its legal review. Harvey had presented it to Dillon 3 days ago, with the smooth, practiced confidence of a man who has rehearsed the performance. What Harvey had actually constructed, beneath 11 weeks of loyal performance, was a masterwork of patient, elegant betrayal. He had spent 3 years watching Dillon accumulate power that Harvey believed should, by rights and preference, have been his. He had spent those same 3 years building a relationship with Bentley Rendell, a financier of dubious reputation and considerable underground connections, who had provided both the motive and the means for what Harvey was about to execute. The chemical ink had been Rendell's idea. It was a sophisticated forgery technique imported from the continent, a compound that appeared identical to standard legal ink under normal viewing conditions, but could be faded entirely with sustained heat, revealing the alternative text written beneath it. Harvey had spent 6 weeks mastering its application. The result was a Clause 9 that, to every reviewer, read as a standard border security provision, but contained in its legal subclauses a mechanism so precisely worded that it would, upon the occurrence of any minor territorial dispute, automatically transfer the entirety of Dillon's personal crown lands, ancestral titles, and the deed to Portland Hall itself into an estate registered in Harvey's name, through 3 layers of intermediary ownership. It was not merely theft, it was surgical. It was the kind of betrayal that required genuine affection for its target, in order to know them well enough to destroy them completely. Nicole entered the study 60 seconds after Harvey left it. Her instructions were simple. Clear the empty glasses near the desk, remove the candle drippings from the treaty table, and be gone before the Duke returned. She moved efficiently, as she always did. She did not intend to look at the treaty. She was reaching across the desk for a spent candle when the low candlelight caught the surface of Clause 9 at exactly the angle her father had spent years teaching her to use. She stopped, tilted her head, leaned closer. The ink on Clause 9 had a sheen, barely visible, practically nothing. To anyone who had not spent years studying document authentication under Owen Robinson, a man who believed that the devil lived specifically in the details of legal ink compounds. It was invisible. To his daughter, it was a flare in the dark. Her mind moved through the analysis with the automatic speed of deeply embedded knowledge. The sheen indicated a solvent compound mixed into the ink base. The solvent compound was consistent with heat-reactive forgery technique, documented in a Continental Intelligence report her father had translated for the Crown 8 years ago, which meant the visible text was a mask, which meant there was another text beneath it, which meant everything the Duke was about to sign was a lie. The door opened. Dylan Parkinson, Duke of Portland, walked into his study with his signet ring already in his hand and the focused efficiency of a man with no reason to expect anything other than a routine conclusion to a successful evening. He did not look at Nicole. He walked directly to the desk. He lifted the quill, and Nicole Steele, who had spent 2 years training herself to be invisible, stepped forward and said, "Do not sign that document, Your Grace." The silence that followed had a texture to it. Dylan looked at her with the expression of a man who has just encountered something so far outside the parameters of his expected evening that his mind is still in the process of categorizing it. Then the expression shifted into something considerably more dangerous. "You are a parlor maid addressing affairs of state. You have approximately 5 seconds to explain yourself before I have you removed from this prophecy permanently." Nicole did not step back. She had not survived 2 years of invisible endurance or 22 years before that of being underestimated by people who looked at her and saw only a young woman to step back now. She pointed directly at Clause 9. The ink on the third sub-clause of Clause 9 has been adulterated with a heat-reactive solvent compound, Your Grace. The visible text is a forgery mask over alternative legal language beneath it. If you apply heat to that section of the parchment right now, you will see the true text. And I believe you will find that the true text transfers your title, your crown, lands, and the deed to Portland Hall to a third party upon the occurrence of any minor border dispute. The precise category of dispute that is virtually guaranteed to arise in the first year of this alliance. He said nothing for a very long moment. Then he reached past her, picked up the candle from its holder, and held the open flame beneath Clause 9. The room held its breath. Every word Nicole had predicted was there. Every devastating, precisely worded mechanism of dispossession, laid out in legal language so elegant it was almost beautiful. The way a trap is almost beautiful when you admire only the craftsmanship and ignore what it is designed to do. Dylan set the candle down with a hand that was very steady. His face was the face of a man absorbing a betrayal of enormous magnitude. Not with collapse, but with the particular, terrible composure of someone who has just identified exactly what has been done, by whom, and what the appropriate response is. He turned to Nicole, and for the first time in 4 months of sharing the same house, he actually looked at her. The door burst open. Lord Harvey entered, followed by 3 of the allied lords, brandy glasses still in hand. expecting to find a signed treaty and a concluded evening. What he found instead was the Duke of Portland standing over an open treaty with a candle in his hand, and a parlour maid standing 3 feet away with the composed bearing of a woman who has said what she came to say and is prepared to stand behind it entirely. Harvey's face performed shock, but his eyes, the eyes that had not quite reached whatever was behind them all evening, performed it slightly too late. "Dylan, what is this? Why has this servant not been dismissed? She has been lurking in your private rooms for months. She is obviously a spy. Guards, remove this woman immediately. She has touched state documents." Then she spoke 3 words. 3 words in a dead, archaic court dialect, the administrative language of her father's generation of crown ministers, a language so specialized it had essentially ceased to be taught. That meant, in precise translation, verify the document. Release her. The guards released her. Harvey's face lost its color. Dylan picked up the candle again and held it beneath Clause 9, this time in full view of every lord in the room, and let them all watch the forgery reveal itself. The silence that followed was the specific, devastating silence of men realizing that they have nearly participated in a crime they did not know they were adjacent to. Harvey's hands began to tremble. Arrest Lord Harvey Ashby for conspiracy to commit high treason against the Duchy of Portland. Remove his crest. Take him from my sight. If this story has your heart fully in that locked study, if you felt Nicole's courage in those 10 seconds the way it deserves to be felt, drop "I'm still watching" in the comments right now. Let's see who is brave enough to follow this all the way to its end. Because what happens next, in this study, and in the weeks that follow, is where this story becomes something neither of them expected. Dylan dismissed everyone. He stood in the center of his study with the particular stillness of a man engaged in a rapid private restructuring of everything he believed he knew about the last 4 months. Then he turned to Nicole, who had not moved, who was still standing exactly where the guards had released her, and asked the question that would change both their lives. "Who are you?" Not, "What is your name?" Not, "Where did you learn that dialect?" "Who are you?" Because he had already understood that the answer to that question was going to require more than a name. "My name is Nicole Robinson, daughter of Owen Robinson, Earl of Leeds. I have been living under a false name since my father's estate was seized following a forgery, not unlike the one you nearly signed tonight, that destroyed his reputation and ultimately his life. I came to Portland Hall because I needed employment, and because I was no longer legally the person I had been raised to be. I did not come here to spy, I came here to survive, and I stayed because..." She stopped, "because I could not watch it happen to another family." He stood very still for a long time. Then he did something that no one at Portland Hall had ever witnessed. He said, to a parlour maid, in the complete privacy of his own study at midnight, "I am sorry for your father." Not as a social grace, not as a performance of appropriate aristocratic condolence, as a man who meant it and knew the apology was insufficient and said it anyway because it was true. The following morning, Portland Hall woke to a decree that scandalized the serving quarters and electrified London within 48 hours. Nicole Steele was appointed personal scribe and legal advisor to the Duke of Portland, effective immediately. The servant's apron was replaced with a simple, dignified dark dress. The kitchen quarters were replaced with the velvet chair across from Dylan's desk, previously occupied by the cousin who had tried to destroy him. And the locked study became, over the following 3 weeks, the most consequential room in England. They worked with the focused intensity of people who have both, separately, spent years being underestimated, and who have found in each other the particular relief of being accurately seen. Nicole reviewed every existing Portland Alliance document, methodically, chronologically, with the trained eye of Owen Robinson's daughter, and identified 3 additional contractual vulnerabilities that Dillon's previous advisors had either missed or, in 2 cases, quietly created. Dillon, for his part, discovered something he had not encountered in 32 years of managing powerful people. A person who disagreed with him clearly, specifically, and without apology, and who was right often enough that the disagreement was not merely tolerable but genuinely, uncomfortably useful. He learned that she took her tea without sugar, but with a precise amount of cream that she measured by the color rather than the volume. She learned that he had memorized the entire first volume of Blackstone's commentaries at the age of 14, and still occasionally quoted it in his sleep when he worked too late. He ensured, without announcement, without explanation, without any acknowledgement that might require him to be vulnerable about it, that Nicole's mother was moved from the modest boarding house where Nicole's wages had been keeping her to the finest medical estate in the county, at his personal and private expense. When Nicole discovered this, through the estate manager, who assumed she already knew, she stood in the corridor outside the study for a full minute before she trusted herself to open the door. She went in. She sat in her chair. She picked up her pen. She did not mention it. Neither did he. But something between them had shifted, permanently, irrevocably, into territory that neither of them was prepared to name yet, and both of them were aware of constantly. Meanwhile, outside the locked study, London was sharpening its knives. Harvey's arrest had created a power vacuum in Dillon's social circle that his enemies were moving quickly to fill. The Whisper campaign began within a week. The Duke has lost his reason. He is being manipulated by a disgraced girl. The House of Robinson was rotten. Whatever her father taught her serves whoever paid for the lesson. She was placed in that house deliberately. The forgery story is her cover. The most vocal architect of this campaign was the Duke of Marlborough, an aging, enormously influential peer whose political alliances had significant overlap with Harvey's, and whose commitment to the existing social order was the specific commitment of a man who had benefited from it entirely. And Marlborough had recruited a weapon. Bentley Rendall had been the silent architect behind 2 aristocratic destructions: the Robinson estate, and, through Harvey, the attempted Portland coup. He had watched both operations from a careful distance. He was very good at careful distances, and he had understood from the moment Nicole's identity became public knowledge that she was the single greatest threat to his continued invisibility. Because Nicole Robinson knew her father's work, and her father's work, the authentic, original work that the forgeries had been constructed to mimic, contained within it, for anyone who knew how to read it, the fingerprints of the man who had commissioned the imitation. Rendall had one move remaining. He intended to use it at the worst possible moment for the greatest possible effect. 3 weeks after the night of the treaty, the Crown's winter ball arrived. Dillon had spent those 3 weeks quietly, methodically building a case, using Nicole's knowledge of her father's original work as the intellectual foundation. Against Bentley Rendall and the financial syndicate behind both the Robinson destruction and the Portland conspiracy, the case was nearly complete. Nearly. He needed 3 more days. He also needed, with some urgency, to address the Whisper campaign that was threatening to undermine Nicole's position before that case could be made public. He made a decision. He brought her to the winter ball as his official guest, not as an employee, not as an advisor, as the daughter of the Earl of Leeds, whom he presented to every person who approached them. with the straightforward, unapologetic specificity of a man who has decided that the social performance of other people's comfort is no longer a currency he is interested in spending. The ballroom's reaction was everything he had expected, and nothing he could entirely prepare for. They had been in the ballroom for 11 minutes when the Duke of Marlborough stepped directly into their path. He was flanked by 3 allies. He was speaking loudly enough to ensure the surrounding crowd heard every word. Portland, I will say this plainly, as a man who has respected your family for 30 years. You bring the daughter of a convicted traitor into the presence of the crown. This woman's name carries debt, disgrace, and the specific stain of a family that betrayed its obligations to the peerage. Whatever her temporary usefulness to you, and I think we all understand what temporary usefulness from a pretty face generally implies, she does not belong among the bloodlines of England, and your judgment in bringing her here reflects a deterioration in your reasoning that your enemies will be very happy to exploit. Dillon looked at Marlborough for a long moment, the look of a man making a final, irreversible decision. Then he stepped forward, one step which in his physical vocabulary was sufficient, and spoke with the quiet, absolute authority of someone who has simply stopped pretending that other people's social comfort is his responsibility. I will say this once, Marlborough, and I recommend you listen with the full attention of a man whose political future depends on understanding it correctly. Lady Nicole Robinson possesses more intellectual integrity, more personal courage, and more genuine loyalty than every person in this room combined, including, with particular emphasis, yourself and the allies you brought to witness this performance. She saved my house from a conspiracy constructed by people you call friends. Her father was destroyed by a forgery, and, before this week is finished, every person in this room will know the name of the man who commissioned it. So I suggest you step aside. And I further suggest that every person who has whispered her name in the last 3 weeks begin preparing an apology, because the truth is almost ready, and truth, in my experience, does not arrive quietly. It was the most publicly unguarded Dillon Parkinson had been in 32 years, and it was the moment Nicole understood, with the terrible clarity of someone who has been trying very hard not to understand something, that she was in love with the most feared duke in England. Then Bentley Rendell stepped out of the crowd. What a magnificent performance, Your Grace, truly. The Ton will be talking about it for weeks. But I genuinely wonder, whether your passionate defense will survive the contents of this ledger. This ledger documents a series of payments made to the Earl of Robinson over a period of 4 years for the specific purpose of identifying vulnerabilities in the Portland ancestral land claims. Her father, Your Grace, was paid by your enemies to find the legal weakness in your bloodline. Lady Nicole did not come to Portland Hall to save you. She came to complete her father's commission. Everything she has touched in your study, every document, every alliance record, every vulnerability she identified, she has catalogued for the people who destroyed your house from the inside. Dylan, no. Look at me. The use of his first name in public in that room in that moment was itself an act of extraordinary courage. It said, I am not performing for this audience. I am speaking to you. Dillon looked at her. The crowd held its breath. The ledger sat in Rendell's hands like a weapon waiting to be deployed. And Dillon Parkinson, the man who had built his life on documentation, on evidence, on the inviolable primacy of the written record, made a choice that surprised even himself. He looked away from the ledger, and he kept looking at her. Dillon held the ledger for a long moment. Then he looked at Bentley Rendell with the specific expression of a man who has spent 3 weeks building a case and has just watched his adversary walk, voluntarily, into the final position that case required. I know this ledger, Rendall. I have a copy of it. My investigators retrieved it from your secondary financial office in Edinburgh 11 days ago. The payments documented in this ledger were indeed made to the Earl of Robinson, but not for the purpose you have described. Owen Robinson was commissioned, under a sealed Crown contract, to authenticate a series of documents relating to Portland land claims. Documents that your syndicate had already attempted to forge. He was hired to find the forgeries, not to create new vulnerabilities. And when he found them, when he prepared his full authentication report for the Crown, you forged his signature on treasonous financial documents and had him destroyed before that report could be submitted. The Crown has reviewed the full evidence. Bentley Rendall, you are under arrest for the fraudulent destruction of the Earldom of Leeds, conspiracy to commit high treason against the Duchy of Portland, and the corruption of Crown authentication processes. The House of Robinson is hereby fully exonerated and restored by royal decree, effective this evening. Bentley Rendall was taken from the Winter Ball in chains. The Duke of Marlborough, who had spent the last 20 minutes conducting a very rapid private reassessment of his political alliances, quietly removed himself to the opposite end of the ballroom and was not heard from for the remainder of the evening. The crowd, because crowds in ballrooms in 1842 were nothing if not responsive to the direction of prevailing power, began to applaud. Dillon crossed to her. He did not make a speech. He did not perform for the room. He simply reached into his coat and withdrew a small cream envelope, sealed with his private crest, not the ducal seal, but the personal one he used for correspondence that was not political, and placed it in her hand. Then he walked away to speak to the Crown representatives. An hour later, in the palace gardens beneath a magnolia tree that had no business being as beautiful as it was in late November, Nicole broke the seal. A single piece of thick parchment, written in Dillon's hand, his precise, powerful calligraphy, which she had watched develop over 3 weeks of working side by side into something that carried, now the specific influence of her father's teaching, were 5 words. 5 words in the ancient court cipher that only she could read. My world is empty without you. She looked at him for a long time, at the man who had called her a parlor maid and looked through her for 4 months, at the man who had believed her in 10 seconds when believing her cost him everything, at the man who had restructured his schedule to be in the rooms she was working in, and moved her mother to safety without mentioning it, and learned her father's cipher so that the most important thing he ever said to her could be said in the language she loved most, at the man who was, beneath 32 years of fortress building and emotional self-containment and the particular loneliness of someone who has been powerful for so long they have forgotten they are allowed to need anything, completely, terrifyingly, genuinely afraid of what she was about to say. She placed her hand against his chest, where his heart was, which was beating considerably faster than the Duke of Portland would ever publicly admit, and she said in the ancient court cipher the 5 words that completed his, "Then let me fill it." The cold Duke of Portland did not become warm overnight. That is the honest version of this story. He remained exacting, frequently silent, and constitutionally incapable of small talk at social functions. But he learned, slowly, with the focused dedication he brought to every worthwhile thing, how to be present for another person in the specific ways that mattered. He learned to say, "I was wrong" to the one person whose opinion of him he had decided was worth more than his pride. He learned that the fortress he had built was not protection. It was exile. And Nicole, who had spent 2 years being invisible, who had buried her name and her gowns and her voice and the particular, irreplaceable quality of her own presence in order to survive, learned that being seen is not the same as being vulnerable, that the right person seeing you clearly is not a risk. It is the only thing worth having. The exoneration of the House of Robinson was completed within the month. The full network of Rendell's financial syndicate was dismantled over the following 6 months, using as its primary evidentiary foundation the authentication methodology Owen Robinson had spent his life developing and his daughter had spent her life preserving. His name was restored to the Crown's records with a formal acknowledgement of distinguished service that he did not live to read, but that his daughter read aloud in the restored Leeds Library on a cold February morning, with her husband's hand over hers on the parchment. History recorded what happened at the Winter Ball as a political scandal. The newspapers called it the Portland Revelation. Parliament debated the implications of the Rendell Syndicate's reach for the better part of a year. But in the Portland Hall Library, on the desk where a drop of ink had once fallen like a secret, 2 people who had each survived being erased sat together every evening and built something that no forgery could touch and no conspiracy could reach. A life built on the radical, specific, aristocracy-defying premise that truth, spoken clearly by someone courageous enough to speak it, is always worth the cost. Always. Lady Nicole Robinson, who began this story as a grey ghost in a great man's house, holding a cleaning cloth in a room she was supposed to disappear from, ended it as herself. Fully, finally, irreversibly herself. And that, perhaps more than the romance or the political intrigue or the extraordinary satisfaction of watching Bentley Rendell taken from a ballroom in chains, is the lesson that Portland Hall left behind. There is an enormous difference between the people who survive by making themselves small and the people who survive by holding on to, underneath everything, the knowledge of who they actually are. Nicole never forgot who she was, not in 2 years of grey cotton, not in 4 months of looking at floors, not in 10 seconds of deciding whether to speak. She always knew. She simply waited until the moment when speaking was worth the cost. And it was. It always is. If this story held you, if Nicole's courage or Dylan's transformation moved something in you that needed moving, tell us in the comments right now. What would you have done in that study with 10 seconds and everything to lose? And which moment in the story will stay with you longest? We read every single comment. Everyone. If you are new to this channel, welcome home. This is what we do here. Stories that carry weight. Characters who earn their endings. Love that costs something real. Subscribe now and turn on your notifications, because the next story is already waiting. Until then, remember what Nicole knew, even in the grey cotton and the careful silence. Your truth is not diminished by the people who refuse to hear it. It simply waits, patient, precise, and permanent, for the moment when it cannot be ignored.